Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of a 10-year established certified social enterprise called the Transparency Task Force. Our purpose is to act as advocates for the consumer interest in the financial services space. We do lots of things, including sending out a weekly newsletter that goes to around 5,000 people spread across 20 countries. We respond to consultations. We speak to regulators and politicians. We run an all-party parliamentary group called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Investment, Fraud and Fairer Financial Services. We are very proud to be that APPG's secretariat. We get ourselves into the media, magazines, newspapers, radio, TV sometimes as well. And we basically do all we can to speak up to the consumer interest. That's what we're all about. Without a doubt, there are many different types of heroes within our universe, and whistleblowers play an incredibly important part in the work that we do. We salute the work of whistleblowers. We believe that whistleblowers ought to be properly protected. And it's for this reason that when we came across the book Wilful Blindness by Margaret Heffernan, we were absolutely enthusiastic to reach out to Margaret, learn more about her book, and learn more about her work. We really do have a VIP with us tonight when we will be listening to Margaret talk about her work. She'll be touching topics of great interest to us. But before we go to Margaret, I'm going to invite, first of all, Ian Foxley and then Liz Gardner to briefly introduce themselves, because their work also corresponds closely with the work that Margaret does. And it'll be great to hear from them too. Once Margaret's talk is finished, we'll be opening up to Q&A and general discussion, and we'll try to make this as participative for as many of you as possible. Mr. Ian Foxley, over to you, sir. Say hello. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction, Andy. And it's a pleasure, Margaret, to be in your company this evening. I have quoted you in my thesis, my PhD thesis, which was published a couple of years ago, because you can't talk about whistleblowing without actually talking about willful blindness, which is a key element in how organizations turn a blind eye to what the truth is when it's being taken to them by whistleblowers. I set up Whistleblowers UK actually in 2012, along with 12 other whistleblowers, as a support organisation to fulfil the needs of whistleblowers in terms of legal support, journalist and media support, and therapeutic counselling, which are the three key needs of whistleblowers, which is what is the result of retaliation and detriment that is visited upon them when nobody wants to hear what they've actually got to say. And then I went off and did a master's looking at human rights of whistleblowers, and then a PhD to look at and research why people do not speak up. And out of that, my network of academic interest in this area gave birth to parrhesia. Parrhesia, for those of you who don't know it, is the ancient Greek principle of the powerful guaranteeing protection to the vulnerable in exchange for the truth. And it is that principle that we want to see reinstituted back into modern society. And we gather and coordinate academic research to bring it as evidence to policymakers to help change the whole framework of what is being done or not being done to support and protect whistleblowers. And I'll leave it at that, because we work very closely with Protect. We coordinate very closely with Protect, who are the leading whistleblowing charity in the country. And I will hand across to my friend Liz to tell you all about Protect.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction. And like you, Ian, I'm really excited to be in the presence of Margaret Heffernan, because we do know your work, and so excited to hear about that. But those of you who don't know about Protect, we've been around for about 30 years. We were previously Public Concern at Work, And we have three kind of roles. One is we provide free confidential legal advice to whistleblowers. Over 3,000 potential whistleblowers come to us every year. So over that period, over 50,000 people we've spoken to about their concerns at work. And like you, Andy, we also have a campaigning and research arm, and we lobby politicians for improvements in the law. But unusually, we also work with employers. So we don't provide them legal advice, but we do a lot of good practice guidance for employers. And a lot of employers do want to get this right, set up good whistleblowing frameworks that work and don't penalise and retaliate against whistleblowers. We've got a long way to go, but there are some really good organisations that really do get it, and we're very pleased to work with them. So I'll leave it at that because everybody wants to hear Margaret, and thank you so much for that chance to introduce us.
You're very, very welcome, Liz. I've put your organisation's homepage link in the chat, and also Ian's for Parthesia. We will be circulating the chat like we normally do. Feel free, folks, to use the chat to make comments, pose questions, suggest challenges to the thinking that's being expressed. We're very open to all kinds of input from everybody. So please do feel free to use the chat, respectfully, of course. We will also be circulating recording for tonight's event, so those who can't make it will get a chance to experience it, and we'll be putting it out on social media too. Let me tell you a little bit about Margaret Heffernan. Okay, so back in 2006, the case of the US government versus Enron happened. Enron. We don't think about Enron that much these days, but what a significant case it was. The presiding judge, this is very, very important, so interesting. The presiding judge instructed the jurors to take account of the concept of willful blindness as they reached their verdict about whether the chief executive of the disgraced energy corporation were guilty. It was not enough for the defendants to say that they did not know what was going on, that they had not seen anything. If they failed to observe the corruption which was unfolding before their very eyes, not knowing was no defence. The guilty verdict sent shivers down the spine of the corporate world. Margaret's book, obviously, is about willful blindness, about Margaret herself. Dr. Margaret Heffernan produced programmes for the BBC for 13 years. Margaret, I'm so proud to tell you that the chair of my advisory group, John Howard, used to run the BBC programme You and Yours for 14 years. I wonder if at some stage you may have crossed paths with John Howard. Margaret, after the BBC, moved to the States, where she spearheaded multimedia productions for Intuit, the learning company, and Standards & Poor's. She was chief exec of Information Corporation, Design Zone Corporation, and then iCast Corporation, was named one of the top 25 by Streaming Media magazine and one of the top 100 media executives by the Hollywood Reporter. We really are with a VIP tonight, folks. In 2024, Margaret was inducted into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame in recognition of her lasting impact on management thinking. She is a professor of practice at the University of Bath, lead faculty for the Ford Institute's Responsible Leadership Program, and through American Co, mentors CEOs and senior execs of major global organizations. No wonder that myself, Liz, Ian, and of course you guys and girls are so keen to hear Margaret speak. I'll get out of the way, pass to Margaret, but just before we do, can we please show our appreciation to Margaret? Because I feel like we're with a bit of kind of whistleblowing space royalty tonight. It's great to have Margaret with us. Please do show your appreciation, folks. Margaret, enjoy yourself, relax, tell us about yourself, your book, take the conversation wherever you want to, and then when you're ready to, we'll turn it into a Q&A and discussion, and we'll be wrapping up in a roughly an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you, Margaret. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy and Ian, for inviting me to do this. And thank you for everybody for taking precious time out of your, I'm sure, busy lives to take part in it. People often ask me which of my 7 books is my favorite, and it's a little bit like asking about your favorite child. But I have to say that writing Wilful Blindness was a very extraordinary experience for me, because I somehow felt that kind of everything I'd ever witnessed in life and thought about in life and read about in life somehow came together and made sense in this concept of willful blindness. I felt that I'd seen so much of it. There were so many things I hadn't understood that it made sense of. And while I would say every book I've ever written, I've had a burning desire to write, I think this book just kind of came together in my head in a sort of miraculous explosion of inspiration. And I don't typically talk quite so romantically about writing books, I can assure you. And I mean, I'm sure I'm wrong when I say that writing it came easily, because no books come easily. But I don't know. It has always. It is a, you know, you can't have favorite children, but it is a very precious book and a very precious idea. And sadly, one of the reasons for that, I think, is because I had set out wonderfully optimistically, because I am an optimist, and in retrospect, very naively, because I thought if I could really pick this apart, then we could understand it. And if we understood it, we could fix it. And so I find myself dismayed almost daily at the degree to which the phenomenon continues. Recently, someone asked me would I like to do a third edition of the book, and I said no. I sort of just couldn't face it. Because sometimes it's a terrible thing being right about something. Having said that, I've never stopped thinking about it. I was thinking about it actually, strangely enough, as I drove home today after a meeting at Bath University, when I was listening to a news account about the leaked data surrounding people in Afghanistan who had helped the British military and how all their names had emerged. And as they went into more detail about the case, I kept thinking, yeah, I know exactly how this kind of thing happens. I can pretty much tell the story backwards. And as many of you will know, possibly better than I do, you know, there's just been such a string of examples. One of the most tragic from my perspective was Grenfell Tower. I wrote a pretty explosive op-ed piece for the Financial Times when the final piece of the Grenfell report came out. Because really everything I've ever been talking about in terms of how you manage organizations and the risks, the places where risk is buried in organizations, it was all over the Grenfell report, which is, you know, it's just a completely heartbreaking report to read. I felt exactly the same about the Metropolitan Police report that Louise Casey published a couple of years ago. I still see it, of course, monotonously in the NHS. And I think just as I pulled into my home, there was a story about, you know, bullying and misogyny on MasterChef. And I thought, this is completely strange. I commissioned MasterChef when I was at the BBC, and I think they should just take the program down. There are things that just go way past their sell-by date. The culture is too corrupt, the fame is too great, the stakes are too high. And there are times when empires, and MasterChef has become an empire, when I think they just have to be put away. Let someone else come up with a better cookery program. Don't try to fix it. Let's just please put it out of its pain and suffering. So, and of course, as you can probably tell from my accent, you know, I'm originally from the United States. I haven't spent very much of my life there. I lived there until I was 8 and moved back only in 1994, where I spent 9 years there running tech companies. So the bulk of my life has been spent in the UK, but I'm shocked at the willful blindness of voters in the US, and I'm shocked by the ongoing willful blindness of the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So it's like, this is a subject that never leaves me. And let's not even talk about the water companies unless we absolutely have to. I've spent a great deal of my life since writing that book, teaching a program at the University of Bath called Giving Voice to Values, which is really about teaching people how to speak up as safely and constructively as possible. Because I maintain quite a firm belief that if we could all become more comfortable with conflict and raise these issues earlier, they would not become as costly, painful, and destructive. And in that, I'm reminded of the saying that Sharon Watkins, the ostensible whistleblower at Enron, although she wasn't actually officially a whistleblower because she never went outside of her own organization. But I remember when I interviewed her and she said she had this saying, you know, serial killers start with cats, by which she meant that when things are going wrong, they always start with small infractions that the organization may see but turn a blind eye to, or think it's not a big deal. And certainly Sharon's conclusion is that actually it's when it's not a small deal that you most need to speak up, because that's when you can stop a problem proliferating and growing. And I'm still very much of that opinion. As I say, it's why I teach the course Giving Voice to Values, which I did not design. I only came across it after Willful Blindness came out. And teaching it teaches me a great deal, I think, about the degree to which people really struggle with articulating problems early, articulating problems at all, and the massive psychological, social, and organizational pressures that persist, which keep them silent. So this is a sort of, for me, this is a sort of never-ending story. And I guess it's also sort of interesting to reflect that I experience a little bit of what they experience, I think, because I work within an institution called a university. I work within a company which mentors chief executives. I work as a parish council in my local community. And there are frequent occasions in which I think there's something going wrong here. And I feel in myself the desire to look away, don't make a fuss. People are sick of hearing you complain about this, Margaret. You know, just shut up. Just put it in the file that says not my problem and walk away. And I don't. I mean, I had one of these today, you know, a problem on our parish council, which everybody is not dealing with. And I thought, I'm sure everybody's really sick of me sending emails. I'm sure they're very sick of me saying we have to deal with it. But the truth is, we have to deal with this. We have a parish council, which is made up of volunteers. And for the most part, they're fantastic people who do hard work. And if we don't have a better culture within the council, they won't want to be there. And our whole community will be damaged if they step down. So I'm very heartened by organizations like yours, by organizations like Protect. And I'm super happy that you are as active on this case as you are. Because if the past is anything to go by, it's definitely not diminishing anytime soon, despite my best efforts and all of your best efforts. I guess, you know, the most current incarnation of this problem inevitably takes us to the discussion of technology and AI. And this is a moment in which I think the problem expands at a more than exponential rate. I run tech companies. I'm generally, or certainly used to be, quite a fan of technology. I've always been, I think, at least a critical friend. I'm very, very alarmed by the consequences for our subject of AI, partly because so much in how it works, it is invisible. That AI generates conclusions, decisions, ideas, and nobody can see how they were reached, which means it's impossible truly to evaluate them. So it isn't even that willful blindness becomes easier. It's that being able to see anything becomes very, very much harder. In addition, and I've talked in other spaces about this, one of the things I do deeply understand is that when we outsource work to technology, we lose the capacity to do that work for ourselves. So for some people, this is very good news. For dyslexics like my daughter, being able to outsource spelling is a gift. But I don't want to outsource my capacity to think and judge for myself. And I don't want the rising generations to be able to reach for answers that they don't understand and could not reach for themselves and therefore cannot evaluate. I've spent a lot of my career since Willful Blindness working with organizations and thinking deeply about decision-making and how we might be able to improve decision-making. And that's led me to ask myself some hard questions about what is the definition of a good decision? Well, it obviously can't be a decision I agree with, right? It's not like I have some magic capacity only to make good decisions. Nobody has. I think for me, increasingly, a really good decision is one that even those who don't agree with it can accept it, can understand how and why it was reached, and therefore it has legitimacy, which means they can live with it. This is definitely the gold standard. And that thinking was hugely informed by my discussions with the late Mary Warnock, who ran or chaired the in vitro fertilization panel that came up with the rules and regulations around IVF. And her view was, with having convened a panel of very, very divergent opinions, that there was no perfect answer to the question around when does life begin, what is life, but there was a burning need to deal with the pain and suffering of infertility, and that her definition for herself, for her panel's work, was that it had to be something that even those who didn't agree with it could live with. That becomes kind of moot in the case of AI. If you don't know how the decision was made, it's impossible to see how legitimate it was. It's very poor training to just reach for automated decisions, and makes it very unlikely that people will know really how to interrogate those decisions. So I think all of that actually accelerates and amplifies willful blindness in quite an alarming way. If we no longer need to make decisions for ourselves, we will lose the capacity to do so. And the decision to speak up, the decision whether you think something is right or wrong, this involves a quality of critical and creative thinking that you can only acquire by doing it. So I'm kind of disappointed to be as pessimistic as I am, because I'm an optimist by nature, and I will keep fighting till my dying day for the capacity of people to be able to raise uncomfortable subjects, to manage conflict well, for whistleblowers not only to be respected and protected, but in many instances to be celebrated really as some of the most valiant people in our society. And anything I can do to help progress that dialogue, teaching, and encouragement, I'm highly, highly committed to. So I think that's probably enough for me in one fell swoop. I'm very interested and definitely willing to answer any questions you have about any aspect of my work, and I would love to hear more about your own. There are no sacred cows in this conversation as far as I'm concerned.
I like your style, Margaret. Thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely first-class scene setter for us. It really was. Thank you. I've got so many questions for you. I could hog you all night, but I won't, I promise. I'll let others chip in. If I may just get a couple in there, though, before we go to Ian and Liz and anybody else that would like to chip in. Do you have a working definition of willful blindness? That's the first one.
Well, my working definition is essentially if there are things that you could know and should know and manage not to know, then you are responsible for the consequences, in the sense that you had an opportunity for knowledge and you shirked it. And that's the one that I use when I'm talking to boards, when I'm talking to senior executives, when I'm talking to any bunch of NHS nurses, doctors, administrators. And then I typically will go on to talk about how that happens and how it may be that we're blind to it. But for me, the acid test is, could you have known? Is the information secret and hidden where you could never have found it? Should you have known? In other words, is it largely within your remit? Is it in your family? Is it in your team? Is it in your department? And if the answer to both of those things is yes, and you somehow didn't see it, then I think the ball is in your court.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And I'm going to evolve that question a little bit, if I may. If that's what willful blindness is, and I completely accept your description there, I get that. What's the stage beyond that where somebody actually does know, because they have seen it, whatever it is, but they act as if they haven't, and they create a false narrative to support the idea that they haven't. In other words, they actively become part of a cover-up process. Is there a phrase, a bit of terminology that describes that, if you like? If we imagine this as a ladder or as a pyramid, a hierarchy, what is the stage beyond willful blindness? Is I guess the question I'm asking you.
That's a really wonderful question. I think if you think of the pyramid, I would say above willful blindness is complicity.
Right.
Your silence makes you complicit. Above that is probably collusion, which is more active. Yeah. And above that is probably conspiracy.
Okay, and I'm going to go one further in terms of context. In my mind, if the individual that has acted in a willfully blind way, or one of the iterations above that, the evolutions you've touched on, being complicit, if that individual is part of a, for argument's sake, an ordinary commercial organization, that's bad, right? But if the individual is part of, let's say, a judicial function or a regulatory function, or they're involved with parliament, or they've got responsibilities in the church or something like that, where there's a greater expectation, well, there used to be a greater expectation of trustworthiness and credibility. Do you feel, as I do, that that's actually worse because they really do have a greater responsibility to do the right thing, not the wrong thing? What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I would say the responsibility is greater, but I would say that the consequences are worse.
Yes.
In the sense that if you're part of government, if you're part of a religious institution, if you're part of an educational institution, inside of those organizations is typically a higher purpose, which ostensibly, not always well articulated, but ostensibly is some requirement to set a standard. And in other words, that you're not only responsible. If you take the example of Parliament, for example, yes, you have a job to do, which is to do with serving Parliament and maybe serving your electors, but you are also a representative of the nation as a whole. And therefore, to the degree that you let people down, you let everybody down. But I think the pyramid is still the same. I think the moral failure may be greater.
The moral failure may be.
Yeah, so if I think, for example, if I were running a news agency and, the boss tended to be guilty of quite a lot of sexual harassment, I would definitely find that repugnant. I would definitely feel I wanted to do something to prevent it, which I might or might not feel able to do. But I would not necessarily feel that person was letting down the entire country. I think in Parliament, and I wrote about this in the second edition, I think the willful blindness of MPs who openly talked about so-and-so let down the entire country.
Yeah.
Because they essentially acted as though certain behaviors were normative in a way that I don't believe the country would wish them to be. But so I think it's much more about what do you think your remit is in your job. If it's just to sell newspapers, nobody's looking to you as a standard bearer. I think in government, people look to you as a standard bearer. I think as a regulator, you are de facto a standard bearer. I think in medicine, there is the Hippocratic Oath, which is to do no harm. So I think as I said, I think the moral failure is greater because you're letting down not only the victims of this misbehavior, but a sense of social cohesion on which an orderly society depends. You're breaking the social contract.
You're breaking the social contract. And this is so significant for your information, Margaret. A lot of the work that Transparency Task Force does, as you know, we're focusing on the financial sector. More and more of our work is looking at for want of a better phrase, the hierarchy of oversight that's supposed to govern it and regulate it and steward it and police it. And frankly, we are routinely now finding flaws in that system. And we're speaking to many people who talk about giving evidence to the regulator that they don't seem to want or don't seem to want to respond to or take action on. You'll be aware there's a massive car finance scandal going on right now.
Yes.
And last week we had one of our guys, one of our members, Paul Carlier, speak about it. And he explained in his talk that he gave the regulator evidence about malpractice over 10 years ago, a long time before they sort of publicly dealt with the matter. That's why the questions I've asked you are so relevant to our community. I'm very grateful to the two sponsors we've kindly provided. Thank you. I can see Ian's hands up. We'll go to Ian in a moment. We'll then go to Liz Gardner, if Liz would like to make any points, ask any questions, and then we'll go wherever the conversation takes us. And we're not going to run out of questions. I've got at least a couple of dozen in my mind, but I won't. I promise. Mr. Ian Foxley, and Ian, if you could, would you be able to talk about the reform policy developments you mentioned to me earlier today, because that might be of interest to some other folks as well, if you're happy to make reference to that too. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm very happy to, because it's kind of relevant to the point I'd like to discuss with Margaret, actually, because silence, willful blindness is about silence, and silence is complicity to the wrongdoing that you know about, if you know about it and you should have acted. But it's complicity from a conscious decision of knowing and taking that decision not to do something about it or to ignore it. And what worries me, and you talked about the hierarchy of through complicity through to conspiracy, is when it gets into the political field, and at the top of our hierarchy is those who lead our country on both the national and international stages. And what happens when you come across government involvement in corruption and political decisions that are made on behalf of we, the people of the country, which are then explained away as you know, the utilitarian view, the consequentialist. I'm doing, it's Jean-Paul Sartre's, you know, Le Mansal, I get my hands dirty on your behalf because I do things for you know, the greater good, this great noble cause, and I'm doing it for the greater good of the greater number. And that tends to be used as an excuse for willful blindness or covering up wrongdoing. And there is a case in hand, and I'll open my hand now. I'm currently suing the MOD and the Department of Business and Trade for complicity to corruption in bribing Saudi Arabian rulers and generals in defense contracts. And the current regime, I mean, it goes back more than 32 years, but 32 years of successive regimes who have facilitated and authorized corrupt payments. At what point in time do we draw the line and say, this is not good enough? If we, Great Britain, want to stand on a global stage and say, we act against illicit finance, we act against kleptocracy, you cannot do that with an open conscience if you have participated and continue to participate in such acts. And how then do we attract the attention of our political leaders to say, enough's enough? You know, this historic series of corruption, of corrupt acts has been brought to our attention. And we are going to put our hand up and say, we are going to make good. And that's question number one, is how do we persuade the politicians to actually be honest for once? And secondly, what Andy was alluding to is a strategy that I'm trying to develop and gain support for, of making reparation for the acts that they have committed and the benefit that they have received, and taking that money, and I look particularly at the 28 million that they fined Airbus subsidiary and popped into the consolidated fund when they are complicit to the corruption and should not therefore benefit from it. And it's not taxpayer money, it's money they levied in a fine, which I think ought to be put to a charitable purpose. And I would say this, wouldn't I, but to support and protect whistleblowers in the public interest, because that's a jolly good cause, and a government who's been caught with their hand in the till, quite frankly. So it's how to push that agenda with politicians who don't want to admit the guilt of what they and their forebears have been doing.
Well, you don't need me to tell you these are very deep and complex questions. I think that, I mean, I would say quite simply, I think part of what you're saying is that there is a defense, which is essentially everybody does it. It's the price you pay for doing business. And I would say the everyone does it argument has a very, very, very horrible history, right? So this is not an organizational decision. This is a social decision that as a country we have to make, or try to make. which is, what do we really want to stand for? And I think this is right now deeply divisive. Do we want to stand for certain principles, the rule of law, transparency, honesty, or do we want to become full-blooded utilitarians and pay whatever it costs to be seen to be important on the global stage? And typically I'm very uncomfortable with binary questions because I'd like to think that it's not as simple as that. But sometimes it is as simple as that, which is, if you have to choose between doing the deal with a bribe and not doing the deal because you won't bribe anybody, you need to believe that you are serving a society that shares your values. It should not be a private decision because you're working on behalf of the nation. And I think in the UK, we're quite divided about this. I think there's a huge division between flamboyant politicians who are very keen to strut a big figure on the global stage, and they really don't care if people think they're corrupt. They really don't care if people think that they're immoral, as long as they have presence, power, prestige, and money. And in a way, as a society, we have to decide, is that okay? Are we okay with that? When you're in a foreign country and you say you're from Britain, are you okay with that being the first thought that springs to people's minds? Because really, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the identity of a nation.
Yeah.
And, you know, I see this at the moment in the United States, and vast numbers of people at every level who are horrified at the thought that actually you can't trust America. You can't trust Americans. You can't trust America. All they care about is fame and money. They're unreliable. They're crass. They have no care for justice. That would appear to be what the American people voted for. So I think it does come down to an issue of identity. And I guess the thing I feel in that context is I'm very dismayed by the degree to which that isn't generally a topic for elections. Elections tend to be competitive bidding for bribes. If you vote for me, then you'll get higher GDP and cheaper houses or faster houses or more cars or fewer cars or cleaner air or dirtier air or whatever. They don't seem to me anymore to be about what do we as a nation want to stand for. I'm personally quite alarmed by this because what it means is that, and I've worked quite closely with some senior people in government, there's huge there's very, very little consensus, I would say, in the current government or indeed in the past government as to what do we want to stand for. And you can see this often both in decisions and indecision. So, for example, I referenced the Casey report into the Met Police. An extraordinary piece of forensic work, and the government chose not to follow many of its recommendations, which would have made more of its recommendations not only stronger, but monitored by external international bodies. So forgive me if this is a bit tedious, but one of the recommendations in the Casey report had been that what was done in the public service, sorry, the police service in Northern Ireland reconstruction, was that for a period of time, an oversight board was constructed, which had oversight over the new police institution. And this was made up of senior police officials from around the world. So they had no vested interest, no intimate connections with Northern Irish society. The oversight board existed entirely to ensure that what the new PSNI would become was what it had been designed to be. In other words, let's make sure we really get this job done properly. There was the decision not to have such an oversight board for a period of time while the Met reformed itself was, in my opinion, a real failure of moral nerve. It said, we're going to pick and choose, we're going to cherry pick the recommendations, but we're not really going to have anybody look at how seriously we're pursuing this report. So that's a decision, it's a choice not to be serious. I think I mean, so what am I trying to say? I think as a nation, we haven't had a conversation, a real conversation about what do we want to be as a nation? Does justice matter to us? Does fairness matter to us? This is no longer the language of political discourse. I mean, to some degree, I think that political discourse has been entirely hijacked by economics, entirely. It's as though, well, never mind fairness and justice and social cohesion and all that stuff. Actually, as long as we balance the budget, everything else will be fine. And I deeply regret the philosophical thinness of political debate in this country. Not that I think it's particularly fantastic in the United States, I truly don't. But I don't see any, it's been a long time since I saw any political leader even attempt to occupy the moral high ground.
Well, I think we have to raise that topic now before David Larry's summit next year on countering illicit finance. We have to have an established position, a platform from which our political leadership can stand. And I think we have to raise that topic and prompt them. And I think we in the academic world can do that by pushing presentations, pushing the discourse, and forcing it down the political throat. Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much.
I mean, I think that's a great thing to do. I really believe economics have kind of stolen our brains, but I do think that an economy that is known for its rigor, justice, fairness, and fastidiousness has a great advantage in the world. I don't think that's the only reason to have that reputation, but I think, like all reputations, once gone, it's very, very hard to restore. And I think that I think we fool ourselves if we believe that we have very high standing.
Margaret, what you're talking about there, and what Ian's been sharing, his thoughts that he's been sharing, is absolutely spot on in relation to some very front of mind concerns that we've got. Today is the day that the Chancellor is delivering her Mansion House speech, and there's good reason to expect there are going to be all kinds of reforms that, if I can put it as dramatically as this, are going to sacrifice consumer protections on the altar of economic growth. Your phrase, I think, earlier was political discourse has been hijacked by economics, or words to that effect. That's absolutely spot on. It really does capture some of the front of mind concerns that we have. What we're seeing is commercial forces, being blunt, very effective financial services lobbying, chipping away at the very kind of regulations that have been hard-earned. Regulations including, for example, things like the senior manager certification regime, which was brought in as the primary regulatory response to the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
It is as if there's a predisposition for people to forget the lessons that we thought we'd all learned and became hardwired into the system. But it doesn't seem like that. It seems like we have the capacity to forget the lessons we thought we learned forever. I'm going to go to Liz. This is such an interesting conversation. I hope everybody's enjoying it as much as I am. It's very thought-provoking for me too. Liz, let's go to you.
I would definitely agree with you, Andy. I mean, again, driving home, I heard that, you know, the sort of wall between investment banks and retail banks and so on, the notion that these boundaries would be loosened, if not vanished. I just sat in the car and thought, has nobody learned anything? This is madness. I mean, how long has it been? 17 years? No, get me up. 17. It's nothing. I can still remember my father-in-law standing in the kitchen, weeping at the thought of having lost all of his savings. We've lived through this. It's not like it's ancient history and we haven't read the history books.
My dad.
I think this is absolutely willful blindness or willful amnesia.
Willful amnesia, that's regulatory amnesia. My dad, I'll just mention briefly, worked very hard all his life, built up a pension fund, went from the UK back to Cyprus to retire, took his money with him like all good Greek Cypriots. He put his money in the Cypriot banks. The rest is history. And it stopped his retirement being comfortable, and it made the last years of his life, he was financially anxious a lot of the time. And when we think about the global financial crisis, it's not just the economic carnage it caused. Oxford University did some research. 10,000 people took their lives as a direct consequence of the economic consequences of the global financial crisis. The human cost and suffering when the hierarchy of oversight doesn't behave as it should is massive. And the question we're discussing tonight is willful blindness, where people don't look at information or evidence that would help others to not have pain. It's tough stuff. Liz, let's go to Liz. Thanks for being with us, Liz. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, no, this is an absolutely brilliant conversation, and I totally support the view that we need to have these conversations, because I think, and there is some research that suggests that actually the general public are very happy to have regulation that protects us. They get it, and so this whole deregulation for the sake of economics is a really scary thing. But to be a bit more optimistic, we've just launched some new research about attitudes to whistleblowing. And I'm really pleased to see that around 61% of everybody would say, I'll speak up about things that I see going wrong in the workplace. And that's really, you know, people out, you know, the general public. This was YouGov, so it's everybody across all age ranges. Workers in the UK are keen to speak up. And I think that's really encouraging. Although there are very interesting differences between generations. So the younger generation are more willing to speak up around, you talked about Greg Wallace and the sexual harassment and those kind of issues. And the older generation are much more likely to veer towards speaking up about defrauding people, criminal offences, and particularly around the cover-up, really big differences around cover-up. But I just wondered, Margaret, is there a difference? You've been working with boards and senior staff over a number of years. And this idea that a board can say, oh, we didn't know what was happening in the organisation that we oversee. I mean, particularly after the post office scandal, you know, is there and people just understanding that the reputational damage to the board of saying, oh, we didn't know what was happening in our own organisation, has that changed? And then if I can be a bit cheeky and ask you a second question, is the proposed duty of candour that the government are promising, you know, to address this public sector accountability issue, do we need to legislate for that? And do you think it will make any difference? So sort of two slightly different questions about what's changing and what needs to change.
Yeah, no, both very, very good questions. I think it's alarmingly easy for a board not to have the faintest idea what's going on. I think it's for several reasons. I mean, I chair a board And, and this haunts me. It absolutely haunts me. I think that the board accounts are extraordinarily complex. In general, on boards, what happens is that the people who understand finance are trusted to understand them. The board as a whole may not. There may be only a handful of people who really do. There is a tendency, and I don't want to exaggerate it because it's not everywhere at all, but there is a tendency to think of a board seat as a sort of pre-retirement perk. And so the attention to detail varies enormously. There is a real respect for the crucial dividing line between executives who operate a business and board members who have oversight of a business, and a deep reluctance to dig too deeply on the part of board members because they recognize that A, they're not in the business every day, B, they will never understand it to the same degree of detail that the executives will, and C, it's not their job to be an executive. And so that holding that line is a very, very tricky thing to do. And the easiest thing is to err on the side of politeness rather than precision. I think many of our organizations are so immensely complex, and Enron was a great example of this, that actually even a forensic accountant would have struggled to understand the accounting of Enron. And indeed, it's my understanding from the last time I looked at this, that on the day that Enron declared bankruptcy, it was not in fact bankrupt, but the accounts were so complex they thought they were. So so I think there's a real issue around the complexity of business structures and accounting.
Do you have a killer question that you on the board would ask? Because I think, we've got the sort of idea of whistleblowing champions and people on the board who ask the right questions about how do they know what they don't know. But whistleblowers, the people who are inside organizations, are often your best source of that material. I wonder if you've got a killer question that you...
I mean, I tend to think that questions are the heart of everything. And I think they're all kind of who, what, where, why questions. I mean, one of my favorite questions is, what change in the world or in business conditions would take this company down this year? And I can think of some of the company that I chair. And the reason, I ask a question like that is, well, so if it were that thing, then that's something we have to keep an eye on. And we cannot make bland assumptions that, well, it's been fine for the last 25 years, it'll carry on being fine. Another question is, which are the key numbers that if they started to change, that would mean something? Because so there's this story is in Wilful Blindness. I think it's such a great story, which is Herb Meyer, who was in the second in charge of intelligence in the Reagan administration, and every week would go to intelligence briefings, and everybody would tell him that the Cold War was going just fine. And he made a very brilliant observation. He said, if the data is consistently consistent, then that's a problem. It's not a comfort, it's a problem. And you need to start asking different questions to see if the data turns up differently. So in his case, he said, okay, so if you were to accept my obviously ridiculous assumption that the Soviet Union isn't, strong as Fort Knox, what would the symptoms be? That is a killer question in my book. if your assumption, if you analyze the data and your recurring assumption is this, what would the data look like, or what would the business or what would the environment look like if you were wrong? And, you know, in Meyer's case, they brainstormed for about 5 or 10 minutes, and if the Soviet Union weren't very strong, you'd see all sorts of stuff. And they said, okay, well, let's see if the spies see any of that stuff, because they've been looking at the same data points for the last 10 years. Let's get them to look for something different. And they started seeing all sorts of stuff that suggested the Soviet Union was not really rock solid. So changing the parameters of success, I think, is really crucial. And I think the other thing which is really essential for boards is not so much to try to assess what the papers say, but to unpick what are the assumptions underlying the numbers. Because the assumptions usually aren't on the paper. And the assumptions are where all the risk lies. So could we just review the working assumptions on which this business plan or the 3-year forecast is based? You please spell those out. And then let us ask the question, what if one of these were not true? What would the signs be? And what would we do? And do we have what we would need to do in that event? So it's a sort of scenario testing. But I think the biggest problem is that the assumptions are frequently not clearly articulated or part of the discussion. They're just absorbed as orthodoxies. You know, this goes back to Greenspan's assumption that the most secure market is the least regulated, which is why you didn't see the derivatives market becoming so dangerous. So I think you want, you know, in a way more helpful than reviewing every number is reviewing the assumptions and saying, well, you know, that was true pre-pandemic. Is it still true? That was true pre-AI. Is it still true? How do we know? So it's getting under the surface of the numbers, I think. And you also asked me about the duty of candor. I don't think it does a damn thing.
Okay.
I really don't. I mean, I think it's a nice bunch of words. I think that, you know, this was first, as far as I recall, it was first introduced as a concept in the Francis report into the NHS. And then they created these guardians, I think they called them, who were supposed to be there to ensure that the duty of candor was exercised. Well, they didn't pay the guardians, which meant that some poor underpaid, overworked person got to volunteer for a new level of responsibility. And surprise, surprise, it mostly has not worked. I mean, I sort of feel, I mean, nobody can object to a duty of candor. I just sort of think if you have to say it, you've got a problem in the first place. That's sort of the deal. Yeah. I mean, it's never occurred to me, probably sometimes to my disbenefit, but it's never occurred to me that if I joined an organization, I would be less than candid. What would be the point? I mean, it's a bit like, it's like, you know, after the collapse of Enron and WorldCom and other things, you know, Harvard Business School introduced a contract that MBA students had to sign to say they would be, you know, legal, decent, and honest. Well, so what? If they weren't going to be beforehand, this isn't going to stop them. And if they were going to be honest anyway, is this going to make any difference? So I think this is a bit performative myself. I think that you have a duty to do a good job, and if that doesn't include candor, what does it include?
This is such a thought-provoking conversation. It really is. It really is, Margaret. Thank you so much for these responses. Liz, thank you very much. Very, very stimulating questions. We're going to go to Professor Andrew Clare. I put a note in the chat. I've known Andrew for about, I don't know, 28, maybe 30 million years, if it seems that way. Andrew, over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. Well, very nice to hear from Margaret tonight and everyone else. I am an economist, and I have some things to say about regulation and growth and some of the very silly things Rachel Reeves thinks and does, but that's for another time, I think. So I want to take you back to Wilful Blindness and the public sector. So you mentioned the BBC, and you've had some dealings with the BBC in the past. It seems to me the BBC have an almost, well, at the moment it's MasterChef, as you said. Last year, I think it was Strictly Come Dancing. The year before that, it was the newsreader whose name I can't remember. And then you keep going back and back and back, and you've got Jimmy Savile and, you know, Gary Glitter and all those things. They don't seem to learn. I can't conceive of a corporation just bumbling along into a new willfully blind situation like the BBC has. You obviously have more examples than me, but I'm just wondering, is that what's wrong with the culture of the BBC that they can't fix it after all these problems? They can't fix it, and is it because they're a public sector organisation that this is just going to go on and on and on forever? Who knows what the next one might be? Maybe Jack and Ori, I don't know, something like that.
A very good and provocative question. I think there are a couple of things. And I'm trying to think about the best order in which to address them. I think first of all, there was a decision made, and it was when I was out of the country, so I couldn't exactly date it, but there was a decision made at some point at the BBC that to remain competitive, the corporation had to offer competitive salaries. Now, I worked at the BBC for 13 years. At no point did I ever earn a competitive salary, competitive with the commercial market. Nobody did. Those people who worked at the BBC did so, by and large, because they got an opportunity to do work that they believed mattered. They got to work alongside really exceptional colleagues, and we had a mission, and we had an obligation, which was, as the recipients of public money, we had a duty to the public to do the very, very, very best work we could, because every penny we spent came from our neighbors. That was kind of the deal. And, you know, this may sound very grand. It wasn't very grand. It meant we mostly stayed in pretty crappy bed and breakfast when we were out filming. You know, we didn't have fancy schmancy lunches. We didn't have fancy schmancy Christmas parties. You know, and it was a self-selected bunch of people who wanted to do a certain kind of work. When the decision was made, no, we have to compete for talent, I think the culture changed quite radically. And there was a sense that, wow, we can do all this cool work and make a fortune. Well, I think there's quite enough, and this is obviously very personal, I think it's quite enough intrinsic motivation in doing radio and television. And clearly the BBC was never short of people who wanted to work there, being knowingly underpaid. I don't think that decision was necessary. I think what it did do, and the introduction of the independent sector into the ecology accelerated this, is it made people think, wow, I could go into more specifically television, where there's always been more money. I could become famous and rich. Cool. And in general, in the BBC prior to that, a few people could become famous. Nobody got rich. So I think that was a fundamental cultural shift. And it's why I think, my response to MasterChef is just shut it down. Everybody's got too rich out of it. Sadly, not me. Well, maybe not sadly, actually, but, it's run its course. Everybody's just milking this cow for everything they can get out of it. I think there should be a real reset. I mean, I still work with people, primarily in radio, who are still mission driven. Nobody ever got famous on radio. They're there because they want to be there. I think, much as, anyway. So I think that's part of the problem. I think a second part of the problem is that for as long as I've been conscious, the BBC has always been under attack from tabloid media. And it doesn't really matter which party's in power. It is, I can remember huge scandals around Northern Ireland, huge scandals around all kinds of things. So in that respect, it has to be, it is held to a standard that I would say no organization could ever live up to. But it did absolutely aspire to. And many of us disagreed with some of the decisions that were made, but I don't think I ever doubted that people were making decisions as well as they could. I think now that we're in a deeply commercialized market, the motivations of people who work there, the career considerations of people who work there is very different. And I don't know how you put the genie back in the bottle, but I do think it's important for us, again, as a nation, to recognize, and we can look to the United States to see this. Once you lose serious public service broadcasting and you have a fully commercialized market, your democracy is going to be in peril. It's going to be viable. I may be overly loyal to the BBC. I still think there are a lot of people who work there doing a bloody difficult job for the right reasons. And I think if anybody believes that getting rid of the BBC will fix it, I think they need to fear the whirlwind.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the BBC too, but are you saying that there hasn't been willful blindness at the BBC over the years? And it's just people with good intentions just didn't realise what was going on?
I mean, I can't remember her name now, and I wish I did. I have such respect for the China journalist who put her hand up and talked about being underpaid. I thought that was incredibly brave. I think she paid a very high cost for it. I think the BBC's done a lot of great investigative journalism. But I think, I guess, and I may be very naive here, I think it's a huge privilege to do public service broadcasting. It's fantastically interesting. It's bloody hard work, but everything worth doing is bloody hard work. And I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest you don't have to pay people a fortune to do it. And if you do, then get somebody else. I do stuff for Radio 4 on occasion. They pay me a pittance. That's fine. So I think the knee-jerk response, which is we have to compete on every front, on everything, especially given how complex the media market has become, which means you will never succeed on every front. I think you have to decide, it comes back to what do we stand for, and on which fronts are we not going to win. And I don't believe that if the BBC changed its pay structure, it would have to resort to the dregs of the population to get anybody to work there. I just do not buy that.
Agreed. Hugh Edwards just read an auto cue and he was paid £500,000 a year.
Yeah, and I think that also means that people get grossly out of touch. They start to think of themselves as very, very, much more important than they are. They tend to live in ways that put them out of touch with people. I mean, I do remember when I worked there, and I don't want to start playing violins, but I do remember thinking, I would really like to stay in a nicer hotel, but I don't think that the license fee payer should have to pay for that. If it really means something to me, I have to pay for that. And everybody I worked with subsidized the BBC because our neighbors were paying our salaries. That's a crucial relationship. But I don't remember people at the top of the organization talking about that, like that.
One of our members in Australia, Dr. Andy Schmuller, we've got to know him very well. He's got a phrase I think is very, very powerful. People are policy. And he uses the phrase to say that you can have a very badly structured organization, but with the right people running it, with the right morals, attitudes, ethics, values, integrity, and it'll never get in trouble because the people running it are just the way that they are.
Yeah.
Equally, you could have what looks like the best processes and procedures and governance controls in the world on paper. And if the people at the top of the organization are a bit dodgy, it will get into trouble. And I say this because it seems to me that we need to make sure that the people being recruited into senior roles do actually accept they have almost like an exemplary role to have, to properly to other people follow. I think the questions about the BBC are fascinating. Thanks, Andrew, for taking us there. We're going to go to Colette Isaacs next, and then we'll maybe squeeze one or two more in before we wrap up in about roughly 10 minutes time or so. So Colette, to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'll be as quick as I can. I've got a little bit of a challenge to some of this. Really, I've been a whistleblower twice in my career. Once operationally, it cost me my job. Once as a board member, and I eventually got a letter of commendation for it. So I really had some experience of living in the thick of this. And Liz, to your point about 61% of people saying that they would speak up, what I have found, rather than willful blindness, is mass cognitive dissonance. It really was. In the first example, operationally, I had in the blackest period, 3 months of my career, I worked for a housing association, and a disabled family were living with grass growing in their living room. Okay, grass growing in their living room. And everybody knew around it. As a new executive, I was taken around to go and see this, like the builders were there, the gardeners were there, the kitchen people were there, the heads of the organizations were there. And it's like, okay, well, we've got this registered as a complaint, haven't we, somewhere on the books for this, because clearly this is not a complaint. This is a repair. Now, if you'd asked any one of those good folks who really, really cared about the people who were in this housing association, who really needed help and support, every single one of those individuals really, really cared. And I'm sure they'd have answered to your survey, Liz. I would definitely speak up if I saw something wrong. But actually, in reality, that's not what happens. It's complicit, collusive cognitive dissonance. They all know what it is, but they all call it something else. And I don't think we'll ever fight that. Equally, in a board situation, I joined a new board. I just had a baby. None of my smart clothes fitted me. It was a government appointed board. There were some very eminent people on there. Somebody held 11 boardships, these really big quality, big heavy hitters on there. My challenge to them was, did they know how much of their budget they actually spent on their statutory objectives? And again, each of them, every single one, really clear they've got the public interest at heart, public money, blah, blah, blah. I did the work. They were spending 12% of their budget on the statutory objectives, and the rest of it was going on mission creep and other projects and other initiatives. And again, you've got these people who, if you ask them and you engage with them, they couldn't be more committed. They couldn't be more caring. They really couldn't. But we all fool ourselves all the time. We all think we've done 6,000 steps and we've done 2.5. We all think we've eaten 5 vegetables and actually we had half a piece of melon on Thursday. You know, like that's where we are. And I don't know how we combat our innate human ability to lie to ourselves completely convincingly. So I put that to the group as a challenge. Isn't that what we have to fix?
Well, Colette, I applaud what you said, because I think I find the 61% number hard to believe. Because I think were that the case, we'd probably be in a better state than we do. We all like to think that we will. It's like, I like to think I only have 3 glasses of wine a week. But I know in my heart of hearts that it's not quite like that. I mean, I don't know, and I'd be interested in what you think. I mean, I teach MBA students how to initiate safely these difficult conversations and how to navigate them. Because I have a theoretical belief that if they can do that, they will need to do it less often. That if they can raise issues when they're smaller, if they can develop a way of working with people where it is easier to have arguments, and if people can reframe arguments as the way that you take bad ideas and turn them into better ideas, some of this stuff won't happen. I mean, it's what you call a very super long range plan, right? But the curriculum I teach is designed by a woman named Mary Gentili in the US, who found that when she did research into people who had stood up against fascists in Germany, the people who were successful in doing that had rehearsed it, or they'd had earlier experiences earlier in their life where they had refused to do something obnoxious. So I tend to think it's much more about a way of thinking and being in the world, which is that my argument is a gift to you. If you want to do something and it doesn't seem quite right, for me to say, actually, is there a better way to do it? Because this way maybe somebody gets hurt, or maybe there's a risk here you haven't quite seen. In other words, if I assume goodwill and I want to take your instruction or your advice and improve upon it, that could be seen as conflict. It could also be seen as collaboration. And I bang on about this a lot, because I think what I see in young people, what I see at boards, and everywhere in between, is a feeling that if I don't just say yes, then I'm a problem. That if I want to get ahead in the world, the first answer has to be yes. And that's a real failure of critical thinking. I don't think our education system does much to develop critical thinking at the moment. But I guess as I say, this is a very long range plan. I really feel very committed to the notion that, and I do this because I experience it all the time. I just came from a long meeting this afternoon where, we had some ideas. I thought they were all perfectly good ideas. By the time we'd finished, they were much better ideas. And they were much better ideas because nobody said yes. They said, well, couldn't it have been better like this? Or could we do the other? Or who do we know who understands this space better? And this is the real work. It should not be this kind of tennis match where there's a decision and a yes, and a decision and a yes, which is what happens in too many meetings, in too many board meetings, and where every question is regarded as a kind of attack, where actually every question is, maybe we could make this decision better. you know, every decision can probably be improved somehow. Because I think until we can reframe, I'm not sure, or are you sure, or is there a better way, as a gift instead of an attack, then the tendency to keep your head down, shut up, go with the flow, do what everybody else does, not rock the boat, the gravitational pull of all that stuff, I think psychologically is just overwhelming.
We're going to go to.
I expect that you feel, Colette, rather as I do often, which is, you know, I'm kind of too old to care anymore. So I will say what I think. And people will always come up later to me and say, I'm so glad you said that. And I thought, what do you know, come on, buck up. If I can, you can. You know,
I'm
I
a
don't
middle
have some
child. I was
special
always
protected
expendable.
genetic. Yeah.
Great stuff.
And so I just, you know, I think we just have to keep setting the example over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for what you've done.
Colette, thank you. In all seriousness, Colette, when people speak out like you do, it really does warrant our appreciation and gratitude. The world needs more whistleblowers, and it takes.
It does, and we need to celebrate them more too.
We certainly do. We're going to go to Mr. Mark Bannister, and then we're going to go back to Margaret for any final quick comments she'd like to share. Then I'll wrap up with a quote I'm very, very fond of, as well as mentioning this book and why I'm mentioning this book. Mark Bannister, to you.
Thank you. Margaret, thank you very much indeed for thought-provoking observations, and indeed for everybody else's questions, which themselves are actually quite illuminating. So thank you all. I would like to offer a little bit of pushback, and Andy knows what's coming next. Respectfully, I think AI is a fabulous thing. It is going to push us. It will bring great merit. It will bring equal detriment. It's how we use it, as with all things, whether it's used for good or ill. But I would offer you the insight that you should hold it in equal regard, both, as I say, for good and ill. On your economic observations, and notwithstanding Andrew's greater ability than mine, I would say that I despair of economics, because having studied it to a fair degree, most people are completely ignorant, don't know what the hell they're talking about. It's very factional, and the reality is there are an awful lot of truths, and there are an awful lot more untruths. And when we are led by people as our current Chancellor, and I don't wish to throw aspersions on her particularly, but she could start by getting her CV correct. That would help. And once she'd managed to get that sorted out, she might understand that she knows less than she thinks she does, and that she ought to defer to those who perhaps know a little more. And then we get further in the world. For instance, this slavish business that she's got to meet her economic fiscal targets, when there is no such thing as a fiscal target. It's an invention of Gordon Brown, who set it out only to achieve credibility. And the only thing it's ever done subsequently, because it's constantly pushed back on, is to deny credibility, would be a helpful start. Colette was talking about cognitive dissidence. I would tell you we have economic dissidence. And but also you spoke about willful blindness. I want to thank you, because I've made careful notes. Your observation around complicity, collusion and conspiracy are foundational, and I have a particular application that I'm going to utilize them for. So I thank you for that. And I also thank you for breaking of the social contract, because that speaks to the heart of willful blindness. If we do not observe the social contract, the noblesse oblige, or whatever, well, you know what I'm trying to hit at anyway. Those who are fortunate in society have the greatest obligation towards it. And
Yes.
we have a group of leaders today that just fundamentally do not understand that. And if they do understand it, they cast it aside in the name of self-interest.
Well, thank you very much indeed for those powerful points you've made. Thank you, Mark, as always, for getting that message across. Margaret, any final comments from yourself before I wrap tonight's session out? Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, well, I would say, just in a quick response to what Mark said about AI, I used to believe this thing about tech, which is it's a tool, it's up to us. And I ran 3 tech companies believing that. I don't believe it anymore. I think the opportunity to earn vast amounts of money and garner tremendous power is a lethal mixture. I think if all technology were free, it'd be a whole different ballgame, perhaps. But I think, you know, the book I wrote after Willful Blindness was a book called A Bigger Prize, because I felt one of the questions I asked on finishing that book, which I kept asking over and over again, is what are the conditions in which willful blindness thrives? Because I was convinced you could never get rid of it. So what are the conditions in which it really will run rampant? And the conclusion I came to was the more competitive the conditions, the more willful blindness you will have. So A Bigger Prize was looking at the nature of competition and how it doesn't work. And my conclusion was, at least capitalism as it is currently practiced is insatiable, and it will not stop until it crashes. And it will crash and crash and crash again. And that's what I see in AI, that we will not ever stop as long as there is opportunity to have more power and more money. And at a time when our planet is struggling to enable us to survive, that's a lethal mixture. And that is the base. I mean, the fact that we are all putting so much attention into AI at a time when, you know, we may not be able to feed ourselves, I think is a wonderful illustration of our capacity to be distracted and to abnegate responsibility for the problems that are staring us in the face. So I would like to think that AI was a beneficent tool and it was just up to us to use it well. I just don't have any confidence that we will. And I don't have any confidence in the people who are calling the shots. And I don't have any confidence in the markets that are rewarding the people that are calling the shots. And I don't have any confidence in anybody's regulation proposed for it or their ability to wield power over those who have pretty much endless wealth. So that's what frightens me about AI. And I also don't have much confidence in boards knowing how to adjudicate between 3 AIs that come up with completely different opinions and advice. So
thank you, Margaret.
So that's, you know, I would like to be more cheerful and positive than that. But I tend to feel that when it comes to any new technology, we should approach it in exactly the way that we do with medicines and expose it to a lot of trials and make sure that it does no harm or that we understand the harm. And we are not there yet with this technology, and we have no right to foist it upon a public that we have no capacity to protect.
Wow. And Margaret, any final comments quickly in terms of the session as a whole tonight? Any final thoughts that you'd like to make before I wrap up?
My main comment really is just to thank you for the work that you're doing, that you continue to do. Thank you for the research. It really keeps stimulating more thinking, which is really, really important. I'm grateful to you for what you've said and the insight you brought to my book. And I'm really, really grateful to you for the work that you continue to do. And thank you.
Well, Margaret, we really are honoured. Before I do wrap up the session, folks, let's show our appreciation once again to Margaret Heffernan, not just for Wilful Blindness, but also for the other work she's done expressed through her books and many, many other things. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very, very much. I've come away from this session with a lot of fresh thinking about not just the solution side of the problem, but also trying to better define the problem itself. I'm going to mention another book because this book, Crash Banked Wallop, is the book written by Paul Moore, deceased.
Yes.
Paul Moore was the HBOS whistleblower. Robert Delmer, one of the Transparency Task Force ambassadors, worked very, very closely with Robert Moore, with Paul Moore, and they became very good friends. Paul Moore's widow has given us 30 copies of that book. We're going to ask for donations, and we have an event all about the book coming up later in the year. I'll tell you the date just in case you want to make a note of it now. The date for that event is Tuesday, November the 18th. So pencil that one in. There'll be more information through the Transparency Times in the normal way, but we are going to be giving away the copies that we've got free of charge for the people who book onto that event. And if you are kind enough to make a donation, that's fine. There's no minimum amount, just whatever you feel happy to donate would be good. I'm going to wrap up the session by making direct reference to a quotation that I spend a lot of my time thinking about, actually, because it helps me define my own kind of purpose in relation to what the TTF is all about. So let me read this out to you. It's Robert F. Kennedy. I'll go off on a brief tangent. I spent a lot of the weekend listening on YouTube to the best ever speeches in the world, getting inspired by them. And so many of them came from around this time, the 60s, including by people like Robert F. Kennedy and, of course, JFK, Martin Luther King, and many, many others. It does seem to me that at that time in the 60s, there was a certain sense of enlightenment and progressiveness that we maybe are lacking now. Mark talked about the inadequacy of some of our leadership, and it does seem to be quite a contrast to what was around in those days. Robert F. Kennedy. Every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. And that is why, in my opinion, the work of all whistleblowers and those who run organizations that support them and help them is so priceless to achieve the society that we all want, a society based on a sense of integrity and ethics and honor, a society with a sense of right and wrong, a society built around the notion that if we all look after each other, then we ourselves will be looked after too. I don't think our society is anything like as good as it could and should be. And I think we all individually have collective responsibility to build the society that we want. That's how I see it anyway. And I salute everybody and everything that's doing what it can to help make the world a better place. Margaret Heffernan, thank you very much for being the stimulation for our conversation tonight. Thank you, of course, to Ian and to Liz and everyone else that chipped in. Very much appreciated. And we'll circulate the recording. Let's get it out on social media and see if we can get some other people feeling and thinking the way that we do too. Margaret, thank you very much indeed. Good night, everybody. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Mark. See you, Colette. Bye all. Good night. Good night.